And joining us now on the debate, Pamela Palmater, Chair of the Center for Indigenous Governance at Ryerson University. Cynthia Wesley Eskimo, Nexon Chair in Aboriginal Leadership at the Banff Centre. Clint Davis, President and CEO at the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business. And we welcome back Canada's 21st Prime Minister, Paul Martin. Good to have you three joining us for our conversation here. Before we actually get to what we are going to get to, language is important, and I have been told probably 3 or 4 different things about how I am to refer to Aboriginal Canadians, Canadian Aboriginals, Aboriginals. Could I get some help on this, please? Cynthia, you want to help me here?
Well, I think you need to understand who you're talking to. So if I'm Anishinaabe, so you would use that term rather than using Aboriginal. We don't call ourselves Aboriginals.
So I would use
Anishinaabe.
what? Anishinaabe. But if I wanted to use the whole basket, what would I say?
Oh, I guess it depends on the context. Again, Aboriginal, Indigenous.
You're not helping me out
No.
here. Can you help me here?
Clearly, it's Indigenous.
Yeah.
We're the Indigenous peoples of this territory. It's the internationally recognized term that Indigenous peoples themselves decided represented us collectively. When you're talking about Canada's Aboriginal people, it's as if Canada possesses somebody. That term Aboriginal is in the Constitution, and that's why people use it to refer to Indian, Inuit, and Métis, but it doesn't really reflect the origins of who we are as Indigenous people.
Clint, can I say Aboriginal Canadians or Canadian Aboriginals? What's preferable?
Well, I would defer to the Canadian Constitution under Section 35 and say Aboriginal people, as Pam said, that includes First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. One bit of advice, if you're in an Inuit community up in Nunavut or in Nunatsiavut, please don't refer to us as First Nations.
Gotcha. Okay. I think that's helpful. Okay, the reason we've got you all here today, and Mr. Martin has set the table for the discussion to come. He's talked about his initiatives and how that can improve the lives of Aboriginal Canadians, Aboriginal peoples. But then comes the next question. The next step, inside the political tent or outside the political tent? What is the best way for your communities to improve their lot in politics in this country? Cynthia, I'm going to start with you, because you actually ran for office last time. You joined the Liberal Party, you put your name on a ballot, you ran in that whole political process. Why did you choose to do it that way, knowing that some of your colleagues think it's wrong to step into politics that way?
Well, first of all, I make my own decisions on what I'm going to do with my life. I think that we have to be a part of the Canadian Constitution. I think we have to be part of the Canadian government. I think that it's important for us to take our strengths to other levels. I mean, we do a lot of work on the community level. Certainly, we don't ever forget where we come from. But I think that we have to be a part of this country in a more fundamental way, in a more fundamental sense, and that was one of the ways that I was going to do it. And it had great utility for mobilizing my community behind me. The kids were absolutely involved. Many of them voted for the first time, and they went to the polls, they did all those kinds of things. I think that's important.
Okay, Pamela?
I respectfully disagree. Having served 10 years hard time in the feds and now being fully rehabilitated, I've seen a kind of a different take on things.
Just explain that. 10 years hard time?
Hard time in the feds, yeah.
Mean?
I used to work for Justice Canada and Indian Affairs at senior levels. And so as much as there are good-intentioned, well-meaning people, the fact of the matter is it's the machinery, it's the bureaucracy, the leadership that makes the decisions. So if you wanted to run in the Liberal Party, for example, you might get 1, 2, 3, 4 Aboriginal MPs, but they're only accountable to their specific constituency, which might not be their communities at all. And at the end of the day, regardless of whether the Liberal Party, NDP, Conservatives are doing anything for Aboriginal people, those MPs have to toe the line. So if, for example, you have the Conservative Party who's doing everything they can to kind of destroy Aboriginal communities, what can those few Aboriginal MPs do but say, please don't do that?
Clint?
Well, I respectfully disagree, obviously, with Pamela. I think actually if you have an Aboriginal person who has run as a member of Parliament, who becomes a member of Cabinet, a perfect example would be Peter Panashway from Labrador, for instance, in the current Conservative government, albeit he's probably very new, but it is a voice at the Cabinet table, and if there are going to be some issues that are going to come up which will have an impact on Aboriginal communities, at least you actually have that perspective, that voice, and I think that's quite significant. So if anything, and I look at my own community from Nunatsiavut, which is Northern Labrador, we've achieved a level of self-government and we're very proud of that since 2005. One of the things that we've noticed, that I've noticed where there's lacking, is that I believe individuals in senior leadership for my government would probably benefit from an experience either in the bureaucracy of the federal government or at the political level. And it's just an understanding, of how that actually works, because you're ultimately going to have to deal with the federal government for a significant period of time.
You say they'd benefit from it. She's got 10 years hard time in there, and she says there's no benefit at all.
Well, I've had 5 years hard time, and I thought I'd benefit, so I do give some strategic advice to the community as a part of that.
Paul Martin, your view on this?
Well, I think the answer is obviously both. I share Cynthia's view, but I also, and I think that we've had a discussion about the political side. Let's talk about the non-political side. The fact is that at this table, Clint is a representative of the business community. He was a banker and a very successful banker before that. I think that it's very important that Aboriginals within those communities be able to speak. Pamela and Cynthia are education experts, the area in which I'm trying to do something. I have learned an enormous amount from the two of them and will continue to do so. As we go ahead, what's going to be, Ottawa has no education capacity. They have to be able to reach out to people who have knowledge. Those people are here, and they are really expressing themselves within and without the community. And I think it's incredibly important that they continue to do so.
So it's important to have people inside that tent for Ottawa to reach out to, you think?
I think it's important to have people within the political process, as Clint has said, but I think that both Pam and Cynthia have said also outside of the tent is absolutely crucial, because that's where the expertise lies.
Okay, I hear you. Outside the tent is where where you think it's at. You've got 3 people here you haven't convinced yet. You want to take another shot at it?
Yeah. Well, I come from a very different underlying philosophy that, we're sovereign nations here in this country, the Mi'kmaq, Maliseet, Haudenosaunee, and so forth. And just in terms of me acting sovereign, I don't feel a need to vote in federal or provincial elections. I don't feel a need to participate in that kind of arena to be effective for my communities and for my nations.
Is that because they're I don't want to read too much into this word, that's a foreign government, it's not my government, and therefore I don't feel a need to participate in that?
Well, and there's a whole context too. If the situation was different, if Indian Affairs wasn't still managing every aspect of our lives, if we didn't have the Indian Act saying controlling us from birth to death, then I would say, well, maybe there's some room for us to make a difference in different areas. But having a Minister of Indian Affairs that's Aboriginal is still someone controlling every aspect of our lives in a very colonial and anachronistic kind of way that's not benefiting our communities. So having them be an Aboriginal person doesn't make much of a difference.
Cynthia?
Well, and maybe we could make that shift as well, because we would be a part of it. But the other thing about that is, we opened the discussion, and the first thing you talked about is the Canadian Constitution and it's how it represents Aboriginal peoples, and then in the I believe also in the sovereignty of our nations. I never forget where I come from, and I'm very supportive of that. I work very hard to ensure that that they're well represented, and that I fight for traditional territorial jurisdictions, that treaty recognition. All those pieces have been a part of my life, absolutely and completely. Running as an MP, I had Chief Connie Gray McKay say to me, we won't make a change in this country until we're actively a part of the Canadian government, and we're actually inside that government and helping to make those decisions. And I think that's really important.
When you were running the show, you did have, was it Ethel Blondin, who was a fellow cabinet minister of yours? And
Yes, Ethel was there.
Ethel was there.
What we did as well, and I understand a little bit what, I don't agree with Pam, but I understand what she's saying, and that's the reason that within the Prime Minister's office, I brought in a special secretariat, because we recognized that while the Minister of Indian Affairs was there, the fact is that you've got 35 cabinet ministers, and what you really need is strong direction right from the center. And it's got to be somebody who's constantly talking to the departments. If you're going to affect this kind of change, I think that it has to come out of the Prime Minister's office.
But I think her position is that despite who's got the job, despite how many Aboriginal Canadians you might have in cabinet, they're playing in somebody else's sandbox, if you like. It's not their sandbox. And they can't have the kind of influence that might be necessary to make progress. Is that, you've had the job, is that the case?
Oh no, I think they absolutely can. It does require a government that's going to listen. Mm-hmm. That's the single biggest thing. But if that's the case, they can play in both sandboxes.
Yeah.
Clint?
Well, we can make it our sandbox, right? At the end of the...
Can you? No, that's the question.
Well, I think we actually can. I think what you've seen just this past weekend in terms of the Liberal Convention, if we actually had more and more delegates out there, we could be able to strongly influence what are some of the priority policy resolutions for a particular party that that is trying to strive for power. Ultimately, I don't think there's anything wrong with the goal to actually have an Aboriginal person who will become leader of any of the major political parties and ultimately the Prime Minister. Granted, he or she would still have to work within the machinery of government, and I think Pam has rightly articulated that there is an issue there, systemic issue within the machinery of government, but ultimately we can create this as our own sandbox. I do want to say, when Mr. Martin actually became leader of the Liberal Party, in fact, the one thing I was very proud of, because I was there, was that you actually had the most number of Aboriginal delegates for any major party convention in this country, and I think that that demonstrated that Aboriginal people want to be a part of the system.
But Cynthia, in that last federal election, last May 2nd, 2011, Sean Atleo was on this program just before that, head of the Assembly of First Nations, and I asked him, are you going to endorse candidates? And he said no. And I said, well, are you going to tell your fellow Aboriginal Canadians at least to get out there and vote, participate? And he said no. I said, why not? He said, because this is controversial. Not everybody in our community believes that participating in a Canadian election is a good thing. Why is this controversial?
Well, I mean, if it is controversial, great that it's controversial. In fact, I think that's something that he should have picked up and ran with, because I think that's important. How do we change the world unless we're willing to take on those kinds of challenges? There are people that don't agree, but that's never stopped me from doing what I need to do. I mean, I think there was a time when people said Native people shouldn't get educations. I mean, I grew up in an environment that said if you're an Indian, you don't get an education. If you get an education, you're not an Indian anymore.
Okay.
So that
Clearly,
changed.
we're past that now.
Right. So why won't we get past this as well? This is just another block or step in the road towards the future that we have to step through.
So is it important for Canadian Aboriginals to vote in Canadian elections, in your view?
Well, it's important for Canadian Aboriginals, but it's also important for Canadians.
For Canadians,
You know, the fact is that we were talking about this in the earlier section. What Indigenous Canada is very much part of modern Canada. I mean, we have been thoroughly influenced by the people who were here in the pre-contact years. I mean, and we grew up together over 500 years, and we didn't grow up very well, unfortunately, because of the way we reacted. But the fact of the matter is, this is not Europe. This is North America. There was an indigenous population here, and without whom we never could have developed. Now, the fact of the matter is, they are the youngest. They are the fastest growing segment of our population. We are not going to build a strong country unless we work in partnership. Whether we work in partnership inside government or whether we work in partnership outside of government, we have to work together.
Did you vote in the last election?
No.
You didn't? You're looking at me like,
No.
what a stupid question.
What? No. No, I mean, they're all making really good points. My biggest issue is how do you run for a party like the Conservatives, for example, that you know has a mandate to spy on, educated, activist Aboriginal people in this country? How do you participate in those processes?
There's no one from the Conservative Party here, so I guess I got to be the guy who says, pardon? What?
Pardon?
What are you saying here?
Yeah, okay, the contracts to spy on First Nations when they're having banned elections, that's old news. The contracts to have people spy on their social media websites. I mean, you've got them spying on people like Cindy Blackstock, one of the most angelic people in this country, trying to advocate on the rights of First Nations children, of all things. And so in a kind of system like that, where you don't have a voice, they're trying to take down your communities, they're trying to divide and isolate and spot, why would you want to actively participate in that? I can't imagine as an Aboriginal person wanting to do that.
Did you vote?
Of course.
You did vote?
Absolutely. I haven't missed a federal election.
So why is it considered controversial for the head of the Assembly of First Nations to recommend to his community that they vote?
Well, the national chief himself, the position is actually a position where you're right, it's neutral, and you have to work.
Not endorse, vote.
Well, there are some communities which are out there which specifically say that they will not participate in voting. And so at the end of the day, I think far be it for the national chief to tell which communities should they vote or should they not vote. It's up to them to decide whether they want to participate in the political process.
And it really gets back to the treaty relationship. So, many of the communities that specifically don't vote or don't participate in censuses and all of those kind of Canadian things, they're talking about the treaty relationship that said, we'll work together, we're going down the same path, but you stay out of my area and I'll stay out of your area. And many of them still very much believe in that. And so I think you know, if that's how they want to exercise their sovereignty, if that's how they want to exercise their treaty relationship, I don't see what's controversial about that. And kudos to all the people who want to participate and try to make a change, because goodness knows we definitely need a change in education and everything else.
Let me follow up with one who just did that. All right, you did it. I mean,
Interesting.
interesting is one way to put it. You got clobbered. I hate to say it, right? So was it? I mean, you ran in York Simcoe.
York Simcoe.
York Simcoe. Peter Van Loan.
Yeah.
So running as a Liberal in a very safe Conservative seat was a tough thing to begin with. Was it worth it?
Yes, it was. I think it was worth it. I mean, just for the sheer experience, again, the education. I met a lot of tremendous people across the riding. I mean, I actually got to educate a lot of people, because that's one of the things that's really important here. There's a lot of people in this country that know nothing about Aboriginal issues, and it was an absolutely fabulous opportunity to make sure that that changed. You know, knowing that we're up against a cabinet minister, it was like, okay, we're up against let's take what we can get out of this. Let's do what we can. Let's talk to who we can, and make a difference in any way that we can through it.
There are enough people, Mr. Martin, I don't have to tell you, who think running for office is a giant waste of time, and that it doesn't matter who you are, you're a peon on the backbench and you can't do anything. And presumably if you're an Aboriginal Canadian, you're already more disenfranchised than everybody else in some respects, so it's even harder. How would you convince them that it's something worth doing?
Well, first of all, I think that if you run, and even more so if you win, you have the opportunity to basically not only speak for the people who elected you, but also for Indigenous people right across the country. The other thing that you can do, however, is a non-Aboriginal Canadians will basically see an articulate person who has an expertise in the field in which they come, and I think that is incredibly important. The other thing is, in terms of public life, you know, having been there, if you get into a position where you're able to make decisions, you can do more in 5 minutes in public life than you can do in 5 months outside of public life. I mean, just take a look at the education that we're talking about. I mean, a government that really wanted to do the right thing by Aboriginal education could change that overnight. You know, and if you're not in government, well, then you spend all your time fighting from the outside, and it takes you months and months, if not years and years.
Pamela, I want to pick up on the first thing that he said.
Yeah.
There probably was nothing better for the self-esteem of young African Americans than seeing Barack Obama with his hand on the Bible taking the oath of office. Is he right when he says there could be nothing better for the self-esteem of Canadian Aboriginals than to see one sworn in as a cabinet minister, or maybe someday as prime minister?
That's a two-edged sword. We also have now, we have Aboriginal MPs, we have Aboriginal senators and so forth. And there's a small contingency that actually do more harm than good. So they're not there as Aboriginal people. They're not there speaking on behalf of Aboriginal people. What they're doing is towing their specific government party line because it got them some sort of perceived benefit.
Which may be in opposition to what your goals are?
No, in opposition to everything. So all First Nation chiefs are evil. All First Nations are crooked. All First Nations people, you know, need to do X, Y, or Z. And so if you have an Aboriginal person really taking the hard right-wing approach to, well, you know, just pull up your socks, that's the solution to everything, and constantly speaking against First Nations, that one Aboriginal person does far more harm than 10 Aboriginal MPs could do good.
Clint, what about that? The role model maybe not such a good idea after all?
No, I think the role model is fantastic. Whether or not Barack Obama is going to be an effective president remains to be seen. Obviously, I mean, he was given a pretty bad deck of cards right off the bat in terms of where the economy was at, and I don't know to what extent race relations has changed in the United States as well. But I think ultimately we will have our own Barack Obama. I think ultimately that individual will be an Aboriginal Canadian who will be Prime Minister, and I think at the end of the day, that individual will have a significant ability to influence how the machinery of government will be able to be run, which should work to the benefit of Aboriginal people.
Mr. Martin.
Let me give you a different example. You mentioned Ethel Blondin. You know, people like myself can talk and everything else, but I don't have the backgrounds. One day, Ethel Blondin stood up in caucus when we were in power. So she stood up in front of about 160 people, and she talked about what it was like being born on a trap line, living on a trap line, living up north. And she talked about her experiences. And she talked about violence within the community and what she wanted to do about it. It was without a doubt one of the most influential speeches I've ever heard given anywhere, let alone within a caucus. And I think it changed a lot of minds. And I think that you can only do that if you're within the caucus.
Okay, let me follow up on that. An emotional speech, it got everybody's attention, it was powerful. How did it really move the yardsticks forward at the end of the day?
Let me tell you, when I became Prime Minister and basically said to my caucus, this is going to be our #1 priority, that I talked about the smudging ceremony when I became Prime Minister, I hearkened back to that speech by Ethel Blondin, and everybody remembered it.
Okay, how about that?
So pros and cons. Like I said, I fully support people who want to run and try to make a difference because they're trying to make a difference. And having come from the federal government system, there's a lot of people trying to make a difference. It's just we can't fool ourselves that somehow me being the Director of Lands and Trusts at Indian Affairs, I'm going to be able to do something other than what's in the Indian Act. You know, there's still those fundamental limitations in our partnership that act as barriers for people like me who do have an education, and I'm a lawyer and I've been in politics my whole life, for wanting to participate in that political system, because you've got the Indian Act and you've got non-recognition of treaties and the non-resolution of land claims that have been ongoing for generations. And I think if you clear up some of that, then you're paving the way to make people want to participate.
And that's the road that we're paving. I mean, there's a lot of people that have been actively engaged in a number of areas, and we are where we are today. We're sitting here on this show talking about the very things we are because people have taken up positions where they were never welcome before, and they said, I don't care whether I'm welcome, I'm going to go there and do this thing. And we've got young people out there that are actively watching and following our pathways because we set them down. If we just always said, well, we're not going to do this and we're not going to do that because we're not welcome, then we're never going to create the images, role models, whatever you want to call it, for the young people that are coming up. And at that conference this week, I had young people in those sessions that spoke up and were very courageous, and they are very engaged, and they want to do more, and they want to be involved. Who am I to say, oh no, this is not the place for you? And they came, and it was terrific. It was terrific, and we saw some tears. You know, we saw all kinds of things there, and the APC, is part of that process. I mean, we all have different pathways. You know, we have elders in our communities, we have grandmothers in our communities, we have storytellers, we have politicians, we have academics. We've got everything, and so we shouldn't be telling anybody that they shouldn't follow those pathways, whatever they choose, because they're all essential for us moving forward.
Let me get everybody to take sort of a giant step back for a second. We're going to take a sort of a view from 30,000 feet above. You mentioned a few moments ago, Mr. Martin, this is a relationship that goes back 500 years. In terms of that historical timeline, the relationship right now between the Government of Canada and Aboriginal Canadians, how good or bad is it right now, relatively speaking?
Well, I think it's spotty. It's parts of the country, it's a lot better than other parts of the country. But the fundamental hurdle, I think, that we have to overcome is this idea that everything we believe is right and everything you believe is wrong.
Who says that nowadays?
Government all the time. Yeah. That was the original mantra of colonization, and it is the mantra today. Yeah. And you know, the best response I think we can give at it here is we have a leading Canadian Aboriginal businessman. We have two leading educators at the table. And what we've got to do is to recognize that they know a great deal more about those areas in their community than we ever will. And they actually have a lot to teach us on the wider area. And we've got to get over it. The mantra of colonization hasn't disappeared.
I mean, is that sending a supervisor in Attawapiskat? Is that part of that?
Oh my goodness.
Terrible.
You know, the answer to that question in terms of the relationship is the worst that it has ever been. And I can say that it's a conservative government, but I don't vote in politics, so I'm nonpartisan.
Hang on, Pamela. The relationship today is as bad as it's ever been?
Yes, we have gone back at least 50 to 100 years in terms of the relationship. There's no real consultations, there's no legal consultations, there's no talking to people.
There's no residential schools. This government apologized for that.
They apologized for the assimilatory foundations upon which residential schools were based, yet they defend the Indian Act, which will define Indians out of existence. We have more children in care now than ever in residential schools. You know, we're not taking prisoners anymore, but we have over-incarcerated our people in prisons. all of those situations, the numbers are far worse. We keep thinking of these wrongs as historical when they're actually worse now. They're just in different ways.
Clint, is the relationship as bad now as it's ever been?
I think it's stagnant. I mean, when you try to compare where the relationship has been probably like 40 or 50 years ago, I think there has been some improvements, and I agree with you. The apology has been significant, but I think you actually have to follow up an apology with some substance, right? I'm not going to say it's easy to come out and give an apology, but you actually have to try and think about right now, where do we actually want to be as a country, and what is our relationship going to be like with Aboriginal people? And I think in some respects there's a lot of white noise out there, and we're contributing to ourselves, and we're very fragmented all across the country. It's very, very difficult for us to come out with one sort of storyline to say this is where we think the country should actually be. But I truly believe if you want to see some fundamental change, that we really have to have a different perspective on what is the place of Aboriginal people in Canada? Because we are one of those founding peoples, very similar to the English and the French. We were here in this country first, and the country, as Mr. Martin said, and Pamela talked about as well, it was built upon the fact that we've had very sophisticated systems of governance in place when contact was first made. So the question then becomes, what should this country look like if contact happened differently?
Okay, quick follow-up here, and then to Cynthia.
Right, okay, so original colonial policies, Indian policy as it was called then, based on controlling our lands, resources, and trade networks, and assimilating Indigenous peoples. Yeah. We hear all the time from the Canadian public and politicians, you know, we're all here to stay, we're all here to stay. That's fine, we've accepted that Canadians are here to stay, but the Canadian government has never accepted that we're here to stay. So once they get out of the business of defining us, controlling us, and legislating us out of existence, and accepting we're here, then all of the opportunities around education, economic development, the resolution of treaties and claims, all of that is possible. But that won't happen until there's a choice by Canada that we are here to stay too.
What did you, sorry, Cynthia, I'll get to you in 1 second. What would you point to say, here's an example of how the government of Canada thinks we're not here to stay?
The Indian Act's registration provisions, which guarantees within 75 to 100 years, registered Indians in this country will be extinct. And why should we care? Because we have our own traditional identities. No registered Indians means no bands. No bands means no reserves. And those lands is sheet to the crown.
Yeah,
Cynthia.
and that's, and basically what she said, I mean, the biggest obstacle we have between us is who is going to control the wealth of this country, and we're all, you know, vying for the very same things, and that's where we have to come back to the treaty relationship, which basically said this is about sharing of resources. This is about, you know, understanding that we have to have territorial jurisdiction where we can live and thrive and survive. That has not been recognized, and that's where we're at an impasse. We're always going to be at that impasse until the government realizes that there has to be equitable distribution.
In hindsight, Mr. Martin, do you wish that when you were Prime Minister you'd blown up the Indian Act?
Well, I think that obviously massive changes to the Indian Act would have flowed from Kelowna. It would have been impossible to implement Kelowna in the way we were really working to do with the Indian Act as it was.
Bob Nault was one of your guys, right? And he was your Indian Affairs Minister?
No, he was, we were cabinet colleagues, but he
was cabinet colleagues. He was with Gretchen. He seemed to make a lot of progress on this front. Maybe I should find out from Pamela if she agrees with that. But certainly at the time, the story, the conventional wisdom at the time was that he was making great progress with that. Is that true?
Well, I think I think Bob was a very powerful minister, and he did an enormous amount of good. The problem that he then got involved in is this whole question of accountability and governance, and it was my view that in fact the Aboriginal leadership wants better governance. This is a myth. The current government is going in there and talking about how they're going to impose good governance on Aboriginals. The fact is that the First Nations asked for an Aboriginal Auditor General. We said they would have it, where they would get it. They still haven't got it. Accountability was part and parcel at the chief's request of Kelowna, and the fact is that was blown up. And so what I think you want to do on some of these issues is, rather than Ottawa coming in, as I mentioned earlier, with hobnail boots saying this is what you're going to do, why don't they just back off and basically say, okay, what do you want to do? And I think what you'll find is we will make massive progress, huge progress, because just listen to the articulation at this table. Well, that's throughout the Aboriginal communities from coast to coast to coast. So give them a chance. Give them a chance.
Okay, Pamela.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. He answered that in the same way I would. Bob Nault was, he had a lot of good characteristics about him. The First Nations Governance Act was a disaster because it focused on tinkering with the Indian Act in areas of governance for people who are inherently self-governing. And so what you were doing, again, with the best of intentions, is trying to tell people how to govern themselves when it was like a fundamental misunderstanding. We're here, we've been governing ourselves for 50,000 years. We're pretty good at what we're doing.
Let me get the other side of it, though. Clearly, Pamela believes that the Indian Act is a disaster and is leading those communities down towards extinction, I think is the way you put it.
Yeah.
What's the other side of the argument, which is that Aboriginal communities across this country need the Indian Act and actually want it in place? Maybe amended, but want it.
I'm actually baffled at an argument like that, quite frankly, because considering that you had foreign governments looking at the legislation as a way to oppress other minorities in countries like South Africa, I think the Indian Act itself is a draconian piece of legislation which actually has no application whatsoever in Canada. And the fact that I think First Nations now, and we've seen it with the comprehensive land claims process that's been in place since 1973. You have First Nations who've gone through that process primarily in the Yukon and in British Columbia, who are now self-governing. They're a third order of government in their respective territory and province, and they're outside the Indian Act, and they're going to be doing extremely well. And in fact, their citizens are going to do extremely well.
Let me ask you, Mr. Martin, what's the argument for having the Indian Act in place?
Well, just simply before you have the replacement in place, you've got to have some kind of a structure. But there is no argument in favor of keeping the Indian Act as it is. Absolutely none whatsoever. I agree with the other members of this panel.
Okay. In our last 10 minutes here, let me try and bring us full circle here to where we started and see. I'm very intrigued at the notion of, as Barack Obama's election was an historic landmark of incredible proportion in the United States, because the most aggrieved minority in the history of that country was now seen as finally getting to the top of the mountain. I wonder if you all believe that that kind of thing happening in Canada for an Aboriginal Canadian would be the same kind of thing. Will we not have, if you like, peace among the peoples until there's an Aboriginal Canadian who takes the oath of office and becomes Prime Minister of this country? Cynthia.
No, I don't think that's necessarily required. I think that we're moving in the direction that we need to go in, and I think we're going to be just fine. As Mr. Martin said, if everybody would just sort of back off and allow our governments to do what they need to do and allow us to deal with our education issues in our communities and keep our kids in our own communities, we'll get there anyway. I mean, we haven't gone anywhere in spite of a lot of oppression. We're still here, and I think that that's something that people need to consider. I tell young people all the time, look at the strength in your community. You wouldn't be here sitting in this room today if we were a weak people. And so you need to focus on what are the strengths in our communities, and that's something that we're doing now. We're looking at that from a very strong perspective.
I once asked Ted Nolan, the former National Hockey League coach, what would you rather be? Chief of the Assembly of First Nations or a Stanley Cup winner? And of course, his very good answer was both. But what about it? What about having an Aboriginal Canadian as Prime Minister of Canada? What would that do to all of these issues we've been talking about today?
Oh, I agree with Cynthia. I don't know if you'd expect transformative change overnight because you actually have an individual who's the Prime Minister and who's Aboriginal. I think it certainly would change the conversation. I think that you would actually have somebody with a bully pulpit who can actually really influence on some of the issues that have to be addressed. In this case, it would have to be Aboriginal issues, just like Mr. Martin did. The fact that it's an Aboriginal person who can connect with the community to a certain degree, I think that would be very valuable. And But the challenge would be as well is there would be incredible pressure on that person to think that there will be transformative change. The expectations, which, I mean, Mr. Obama put on himself to a certain degree, was massive. And I think in this particular case, there'd be huge expectations that this individual would be opening up the floodgates, and before you know it, Aboriginal people would be doing this, that, and the other thing. And I think that individual would have to manage expectations, not only from the Aboriginal community, but from across the country as well.
Are you telling us, Pamela, that if Sean Atleo were the Prime Minister of Canada, that would not be a great thing for this country?
Well, you have to pick someone else first. Okay, so it couldn't be Sean Atleo.
Why?
But
He's the leader of the AFN today. What's wrong with him?
He doesn't seem to have a whole lot of support across the country from a large number of chiefs. So I don't know that as being Prime Minister, that would garner him any more support. But there's other
somebody
things.
who's 10 years old right now and think about 40 years down the road.
Well, that's about it.
Yeah, well, and it really depends. A lot of, and certainly from my experience within the federal government, any file, it could be litigation, it could be a major initiative, sometimes it all boils down to one person and their personality and the amount of sway and influence that they have. So if you had the right person, I think it could make a world of difference. But I don't know that focusing all of our attention on finally getting one person into the role of Prime Minister is what will bring about transformative change. I think empowering our grassroots people is far more effective. Education, food, water, the very basics that Canadians take for granted. These are the things that will help Indigenous people move forward. And my dream is not for an Aboriginal Prime Minister, it's that every one of our Indigenous children can speak their own language. And know everything about their culture and feel a sense of connectedness to their community. Everything else is just a bonus.
Mr. Martin, what would it do to the relationship between Canadians and Canadian Aboriginals to see somebody do a smudge ceremony for them, because they were the Prime Minister?
Well, I think it would be incredibly symbolic, but I don't think that we can look to a quick fix like that, to be quite honest, Steve. I think that what's going to happen here is the transformative change is going to have to take place within the education system the way that it did for the rest of us. All of us came here as immigrants. None of us came here as highly, I mean, my Irish ancestors, let me tell you, nobody thought that there would be Irish Canadians who would ever become Prime Minister of this country, and the fact is that they did. But it was the free, universal education system that did it. And I think that that's the area in which transformative change has got to take place.
Clint?
I actually think it's, I agree with Mr. Martin, and obviously I'm surrounded by educators, so I'm going to have to say education is key. But having said that, I think self-government is fundamental, and I hearken back to my government, New Nazi-Vuk government, and it was what Cynthia said earlier in terms of this sharing of resources. We've been able to negotiate a resource revenue sharing royalty agreement whereby we get a portion of the royalties from the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, which is accumulated well over $100 million from the Voisey's Bay nickel mine that we see in development within our traditional territory. That's a huge, that's a huge amount of capital for our government. We passed legislation in our legislative assembly, which actually has the authority to, depending upon the issue that you're dealing with, comparable to the province of Newfoundland and Labrador and the federal government. It's a third order of government. We are in control of our own affairs, and if anybody from the outside, a business community or anything like that, or a business is trying to come in to do business within our territory, they have to deal with us. That's fundamental, and I think ultimately that's what we're trying to achieve.
If an Aboriginal Canadian were Prime Minister of this country, would they still be accused of being sellouts by some members of the community?
Well, it depends which party they were with, and it depends how they got there.
Okay, let's think about this. What party would be a disqualifying
So,
factor?
for example, say you were an Aboriginal politician and you gave up your seat as an Aboriginal politician to become a Conservative senator, and then your main goal was to trash First Nations all across the country.
Who could you possibly be referring to there?
I'm just saying.
I think I know. I think I know.
We have Charlie Watts as a senator who's been a senator for a very long time and has done a tremendous job. And I asked him, how come you're here? You know, you're in your 70s. How come you're here at a time, and you've been here from a long time ago? And he said, because my mom told me that I better make something of myself, and she pushed us. And he said, and all of my siblings have done very well because she pushed us.
I got a minute left here, and I want to give it to Paul Martin to talk about this. As of 2008, this is a report from the Government of Canada, only 27 self-identifying Aboriginal people out of 10,384 potential seats in the House of Commons since Confederation. 27 out of more than 10,000. What do you think can be done to bring more Canadian Aboriginals into the political process from an elective point of view in this country?
Well, I think that there's obviously got to be a reaching out, and it's got to be in depth, and it also has to be, the reach out has to be done by political parties who are saying, we understand where you're coming from, and we want you to come in and influence us. We're not saying to you, you come here and toe the party line. We're saying to you, you come here. We don't fully understand, and we probably will never understand the evolution. You come here and you make us understand. I'll tell you the second thing. Just do this. Do this. I mean, this conversation that we just heard around this table, the people who are watching it, they cannot help but be influenced by the ability to articulate the vision that is being set out and the differences of opinion. And that's really important, to see those differences of opinion. You're not dealing with sort of one common party message here. What you're doing is you're seeing very intelligent, articulate people saying, we want to build this country, we want to build it together, and we want to build it on behalf of our people. Do this more often.
I want to thank all of you for coming in and participating in our roundtable here today. Pamela Palmater from Ryerson University, Clint Davis from the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, Cynthia Wesley Eskimo from the Banff Centre, and of course, 21st Prime Minister of Canada, Paul Martin. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.